I think there is no better laboratory than the New World, the Americas, for understanding how different institutions have formed, how they have been supported by different political systems, different distributions of political power, and how that has led to a huge economic divergence. After all, the economic and political institutions in the New World have been largely shaped by their colonization experience, starting at the beginning of the 16th century. And of course, the tales of Pizarro and Cortez are quite familiar, but let me start from another one of the conquistadors with de Solis, who around 1516 started the colonization of the southern cone of the South America, what is today Argentina and Uruguay. Under de Solis' leadership, they also founded the city of Buenos Aires. So those are areas that we now think are very attractive. Buenos Aires, good airs, is the sort of climate that Europeans are used to. Around Buenos Aires, both in Argentina and Uruguay, are very fertile lands that then became the basis of almost a century of very high income per capita in Argentina because of the productivity of these areas. But actually, the colonization of this area was a total failure. It was a total failure because the Spaniards arrived there with a given model of colonization. And their model of colonization was get the gold, get the silver, and most importantly, capture and enslave Indians so that they would mine the gold and the silver, and they would produce food for us, and they would produce other commodities for sale. So what the first thing that they wanted to do was to find the Indians and capture them. Unfortunately, from their point of view, the native population of the area, the Charruas and the Querandi, were hunter-gatherers, very sparsely settled, very mobile, and without as much of the hierarchy that they were later to encounter in other parts of Latin America. So the Spaniards tried to capture them. They fought back. They quickly clubbed de Solis to death, so that de Solis wasn't one of the famous conquistadors that went on the history books. But more importantly, they were not enough of them, and they would refuse to work. When captured, the Spaniards starved, and as starvation set in, many of them died, and the remainder said, forget about this place, and they move up the Parana River to what is today Asunción, Paraguay. There they encountered another band of Indians, which, on the surface looks a little similar to the Querandi and the Charruas, the Guarani. But the Guarani were a little different. They were already a little more settled. They were more densely settled, so there was a denser population density. And also they already had established a hierarchical society with their princes and princesses and their own elite, and the rest of the population working for the benefit of the elite. So the conquistadors immediately took over that hierarchy. They set themselves up as the elite. They married some of the princesses, and they put the Guarani to work to produce foodstuff for them. They didn't starve in Paraguay. Then that was a very successful colony that survived for many centuries. And the sort of institutions that they established in the Guarani were the sorts of institutions that they established in other parts of Latin America after the conquest of the Aztecs and the Inca. There were institutions such as encomienda, repartimiento, trajín, mita, essentially forced labor institutions. People would be, the Indians would be assigned with land grants to the Spaniards or to the elite that they created. People would be forced to work, whatever wage that they were offered. They were under constant coercive pressure. The repartimiento is that not only they were forced to work, but they were also forced to buy whatever their elites sold them. The mita was a forced labor system for them to produce silver, for example, in the Potosi mine, and so on and so forth. And it's no surprise that those sorts of economic institutions did not encourage economic growth. And it's also no surprise that the political institutions that were the basis of this persisted and created and kept recreating elites that did not encourage economic development in Latin America. Now, of course, you can say, well, the big difference perhaps there was the model of colonization of the Spaniards, perhaps the values that the Spaniards brought, perhaps the religion that they brought, and so on and so forth. But actually, when we turn to the colonization of North America, we see that it wasn't these factors that were important. So again, starting at the early stages of that colonization, we can start at the beginning of the 17th century with the Jamestown colony in Virginia that the Virginia Company set up. The model of the Virginia Company and the elite captains and the aristocrats that they sent to North America were actually remarkably similar to the model of colonization of the conquistadors. They also wanted gold, and they also thought that they would actually be able to capture and enslave Indians and put them to work. And Unfortunately for them, they encountered very similar situations to those in Argentina and Uruguay that de Solis and his men encountered. So the Indians were again very, very sparsely settled. They were very mobile and not willing to work, not willing to provide food for them. And very similarly, they also went through the starving time, only surviving perhaps thanks to the ingenuity of John Smith and some of the other few people on the early stages of the colony. But while the Spaniards had the option of moving up the Parana River and finding another more densely settled and hierarchical society to take over, the captains of the Virginia Company didn't have that option, because no such civilization existed in any of the neighborhoods, in any of the areas that they were conquering. So they came up with a second strategy. The second strategy was, okay, we cannot enslave the Indians to put them to work for us. Well, we can bring our own lower strata of society. So they brought the indentured servants from England so that they would be the elite, and the indentured servants would do the production and would be the bottom of society. And just to give you a sense of this, let me just quote directly from the laws that the governor of the colony at the time, Sir Thomas Gates, and his deputy, Sir Thomas Dale, passed. So these laws go, for example, in one section: no man or woman shall run away from the colony to the Indians upon pain of death. Anyone who robs a garden, public or private, or a vineyard, or who steals ears of corn shall be punished with death. No member of the colony will sell or give any commodity of this country to a captain, mariner, master, or sailor to transport out of the colony or for his own private use upon pain of death. So when you read these laws, you realize two things. This was not a sort of a happy democratic colony that they were founding based on uniquely English or British values. The second thing is that there were actually real problems that they were worried about. And the real problems that they were worried about was that it was very difficult to keep these settlers that they brought as the lower strata of the society to do the production and not run away or not engage in trade out of their own production. So they fought against this for a couple more years, but at the end they decided there's no chance, there's no way. Whatever we threaten to do, we're not going to be able to keep them doing what we want. So finally they came up with a third strategy. And their third strategy was a very radical and a very different one. They said, why don't we give these settlers economic incentives? Not because that was better for them, but because that was the only option left for them. So they came up with the head right system where each settler would be given land and they would do their own production and they would have secure property rights. But there was only one problem. So there was Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale just 6 months ago threatening to kill you because you were trading with a sailor or you took 1 ear of corn. How could you trust them when they tell you that you have secure property rights? There's a problem there. So that problem showed itself in the next year when they couldn't resist taking the next step, but to make the economic incentives credible, now they had to give them political rights as well. So the General Assembly followed in 1619, 1 year after the head right system, and now through the General Assembly, these settlers were no longer the lower strata of the society, but they were going to make their own decisions through more inclusive political institutions. So I think what this what this historical example illustrates is several ideas that are important. The first one is the complementarity or the feedback effects between inclusive economic and political institutions. Inclusive economic institutions do need inclusive political institutions. It's going to be very difficult for them to survive under extractive political institutions. And likewise, extractive economic institutions need extractive political institutions and vice versa. The sort of economic institutions like the encomienda, trajín, repartimiento would not have been possible if the Spaniards had set up a democratic system in which the native Indians or the native populations would actually have political rights. The second important idea is that none of these theories that I've talked about as the alternative theories really have much explanatory power in this instance. It wasn't because the geography had any important effect. If anything, as I've already indicated, the already existing and more developed civilizations were the ones that ended up with the worst set of institutions because that's where the population was and that's where the extractive institutions were feasible and more profitable for the Spanish conquistadors. It had nothing to do with values or culture that the colonizers had, because the model of colonization and what they wanted to do was very similar. It didn't matter whether they were Spanish or English. They were after the the goal, and they were after enslaving the populations they wanted to capture. And enlightened leadership had nothing to do with it either, because they didn't have different ideas about what they wanted to do. Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale would have loved to do what the Ayolas, the person who's founded the Asuncion colony, or the Toledo, who did the Potosi mines, had done and set up those extractive systems. They just couldn't do it. So it wasn't about enlightened leadership, it was about failed leadership in North America. So those really highlight the sort of ideas that are really at the center of the book, because they show both why inclusive and extractive economic institutions are important, and why inclusive and extractive economic institutions, in turn, are based on inclusive and extractive political institutions. So the political process that underpins this.